How does a man forged for war, a general who believes he is destined for glory, react when his own actions threaten to destroy everything he has ever worked for? What happens when a hero, at the very peak of his triumph, commits an act so shocking it risks not only his career, but the war effort itself? This is the story of General George S. Patton, Jr., America's most audacious and controversial commander, and the two slaps that echoed across the globe, forcing him into a battle not against the enemy, but against his own demons. It's a story of ego, discipline, and the brutal psychological cost of war, culminating in the moment Patton was stripped of his command and forced to confront the consequences of his rage. It's a story that forces us to question the very nature of leadership in wartime. If you believe these complex stories from the past deserve to be told, take a moment to subscribe to our channel, like this video, and share it with someone who appreciates history's difficult lessons. Let us know in the comments one thing you already know about General Patton. To understand the fall, we must first appreciate the dizzying heights of the climb. By the summer of 1943, Lieutenant General George S. Patton was more than a commander. He was a living legend, a pure, unfiltered force of nature. He was America's thunderbolt, a warrior who devoutly believed he was a reincarnated soul, destined to lead armies to glory across the ages. This wasn't just a persona. It was a deeply held conviction that fueled his every action. Months earlier, the fledgling U.S. Army had suffered a catastrophic and humiliating defeat in Tunisia at the Kasserine Pass. It was a bloody nose delivered by Owen Rommel's veteran Afrika Korps, a brutal lesson that exposed the inexperience of American troops and leadership. In the wake of this disaster, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the supreme Allied commander, needed a man who could instill discipline and a fighting spirit into the battered Two Corps. He called him Patton. Arriving on March 6, 1943, Patton descended like a whirlwind. He was a torrent of profane, inspirational fury. He demanded that his men wear neckties and leggings, that their boots be shined to a mirror finish, even in the windswept desert. This wasn't about parade ground vanity. It was psychology. Patton believed that a soldier who looks the part, who carries himself with pride and discipline, will fight with that same ferocity. He hammered the broken remnants of the Two Corps back into a formidable weapon, restoring its confidence and turning the tide in North Africa. His reward was the command of the newly formed U.S. 7th Army for Operation Husky, the Allied invasion of Sicily. Launched on July 10, 1943, it was the largest amphibious operation of the war to that date, a colossal armada of ships carrying 150,000 men to the shores of Europe. Here, Patton's aggressive spirit was fully unleashed. As his famous British rival, the cautious and methodical General Bernard Montgomery, slogged his way up the island's eastern coast, Patton chafed at his assigned role of protecting Montgomery's flank. Seeing an opportunity, he defied the initial plan and sent his forces on a stunning flanking maneuver. He drove his army on a breathtaking 100-mile dash in just 4 days, capturing the Sicilian capital of Palermo on July 22nd. He was everywhere, his famous ivory-handled pistols on his hips, a symbol of his warrior ethos, urging his men forward with a mixture of patriotic fire and blistering profanity. He was on the cover of American magazines, and in the halls of German high command, he was considered the most dangerous and feared of all Allied generals. But this spectacular victory came at a horrific price. The 38-day Sicilian campaign was brutal. Soldiers fought under a punishing Mediterranean sun, their bodies racked by malaria, dysentery, and the constant strain of combat. The island's mountainous terrain offered a significant advantage to the dug-in German and Italian defenders. The fighting was savage, and the Allied forces suffered over 22,000 casualties. Many of the wounds, however, were invisible. In the First World War, it was called shell shock, a term coined in 1915 to describe the tremors, amnesia, and paralysis that afflicted men exposed to the trauma of the trenches. By 1943, the U.S. Army officially referred to it as exhaustion or battle fatigue, a clinical-sounding euphemism for a mind breaking under the sheer, unendurable weight of modern warfare. To a man like George S. Patton, who had cultivated an iron will and a belief in destiny, this concept was not just foreign, it was anathema. He saw it not as a legitimate wound, but as a moral failing, a contagion of cowardice. He heard reports that evacuation hospitals were filling with men he deemed malingerers, men faking illness to escape the front lines. On August 5th, he issued a directive forbidding battle fatigue as a diagnosis in his 7th Army. For Patton, a man was either wounded in glorious combat or he was a coward. There was no middle ground. This rigid, unyielding conviction was about to collide with the fragile humanity of his own soldiers in a way that would shake the Allied command to its core. The first collision occurred on August 3rd, 1943. Patton, making a tour of the 15th Evacuation Hospital, intended to visit his wounded men, the heroes paying the price for his victory. He moved through the sweltering tents, offering words of encouragement to soldiers with grievous physical injuries. Then, he came upon Private Charles H. Cole, a young soldier from Indiana, who was sitting slumped on a supply box, seemingly unharmed. "What's wrong with you?" Patton demanded. The private, likely terrified in the presence of the legendary general, replied simply, "I guess I just can't take it." For Patton, standing in a tent filled with shattered bodies and mangled limbs, this admission was the ultimate sin. His face flushed with rage. He snarled, "What did you say?" The soldier repeated himself. What Patton did not know, and what the private failed to articulate, was that his medical chart noted a diagnosis of psychoneurosis anxiety. Furthermore, he was running a fever of over 102 degrees and was suffering from malaria and dysentery, debilitating physical ailments common in the campaign. But Patton saw only a man who had given up. He exploded in a tirade, calling Cole a goddamn coward. He slapped the soldier across the chin with his gloves, grabbed him by the collar, and hauled him to his feet. He then violently kicked him out of the tent, shouting, "You're going back to the front. You ought to be shot." That night, Patton recorded the event in his diary, noting with a sense of grim satisfaction that he had encountered the only errant coward I have ever seen in this army. He felt no remorse. He believed he had done his duty, reinforcing the discipline that wins wars. He had no idea he had just lit a fuse that would smolder for 7 days before igniting a second, even larger explosion. Word of the first incident spread like wildfire among the hospital's medical staff, who were horrified by the general's actions. But the news was kept within channels, and Patton, oblivious and unrepentant, was about to repeat his mistake. A week later, on August 10th, he visited the 93rd Evacuation Hospital. There he found 21-year-old Private Paul G. Bennett, who was huddled on his cot, shivering and sobbing. Bennett was suffering from severe dehydration and nervous exhaustion. A close friend had been wounded in action right beside him, and the trauma had overwhelmed him. Patton, seeing the soldier crying, strode to his bedside. "What's the matter with you?" he barked. Through his tears, Bennett managed to choke out the words, "It's my nerves, sir. I can't stand the shelling anymore." If Patton's rage had been hot a week before, it was now volcanic. "Your nerves?" he screamed. "Hell, you are just a goddamn coward." He slapped Bennett hard across the face, the force of the blow knocking the man's helmet liner off. Then, in a terrifying escalation, Patton reached for one of his famous ivory-handled pistols. "You ought to be lined up against a wall and shot," he raged at the terrified soldier. "In fact, I ought to shoot you myself right now. God damn you." Doctors and nurses rushed to intervene, and the hospital's commanding officer, Colonel Donald Currier, was forced to physically place himself between the furious general and the weeping private. This time, the incident was too public, too violent to be contained. A formal report detailing the assault was written by the corps surgeon and sent up the chain of command. It landed like a bombshell on the desk of the one-man Patton had to answer to, Supreme Allied Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower. This single moment represents a crossroads, not just for a man, but for an entire army. It's these pivotal points in history that reveal the true character of leaders. If you're finding this deep dive into a commander's crisis compelling, we'd be grateful if you'd subscribe, like the video, and share it with a friend. We'd love to read your thoughts in the comments below. What would you have done in Eisenhower's position? In his headquarters in Algiers, Eisenhower was appalled. He was a man who prized professionalism, teamwork, and control above all else. He knew Patton was a brilliant, aggressive commander, but he was also acutely aware of what he called his subordinates' unfortunate traits. This, however, was far beyond a personality quirk. It was the abuse of sick and helpless men under his own command. Eisenhower was caught in a terrible bind. On one hand, he privately admitted that Patton was indispensable to the war effort, one of the guarantors of our victory. To fire his most effective combat general would be a devastating blow to American morale and a massive propaganda victory for the Nazis. On the other hand, the story was already known to a group of influential war correspondents, including Demery Bess of the Saturday Evening Post. They had initially agreed to keep the story quiet, but were now demanding Patton's dismissal in exchange for their continued silence. The story was a ticking time bomb that threatened to explode into a public relations catastrophe. Eisenhower had to walk a razor's edge. He needed to punish Patton severely, but he also needed to save him for the war. His decision came in the form of a letter dated August 17, 1943. It was a masterpiece of controlled fury, a cold, sharp reprimand delivered from a superior to a subordinate. "I must so seriously question your good judgment and your self-discipline," Eisenhower wrote, "as to raise serious doubts in my mind as to your future usefulness." The letter was a direct challenge to Patton's entire identity as a commander and a warrior. Eisenhower concluded with an unambiguous threat. Any repetition of such reprehensible behavior would lead to your immediate relief from command. The letter arrived on the very day that Patton's 7th Army marched triumphantly into the city of Messina, concluding the Sicily campaign. At the peak of his military glory, Patton was shattered. The full weight of his actions and their potential consequences finally crashed down upon him. His entire career, his destiny, was hanging by a single thread. His reaction was not a single, defiant explosion, but a messy, agonizing mix of rage, profound self-pity, and the slow, horrifying realization of his blunder. In the privacy of his diary, he fumed that his superiors expected him to soft-soap a skulker. But to his aides, his bravado was laced with desperation. The ultimate punishment followed swiftly. The day after the fall of Messina, Eisenhower dissolved the 7th Army headquarters. Patton's command was gone. He was left behind in Sicily, a conquering hero in forced exile, ordered to perform the one act he found almost impossible, to apologize. For a man of Patton's immense pride, apologizing was a humiliation worse than any battlefield defeat. It was a public stripping of his authority, a confession of weakness. Yet he had no choice. And so began one of the strangest and most telling episodes of the war, General Patton's apology tour. First, on August 21st, he had to face Private Bennett in his office. They shook hands as Patton offered his regrets. 2 days later, Private Cool was brought in for his own formal apology and handshake. Next, he had to face the doctors and nurses who had witnessed his tirades, expressing regret for his impulsive actions. But the most grueling part was the order to apologize to every division that had served under him in the 7th Army. For weeks, he traveled across the dusty landscape of Sicily, standing on makeshift platforms before thousands of his soldiers to admit his mistake. The reaction from the troops was complex and unpredictable. The men of the 1st Infantry Division, Private Cole's unit, reportedly received him with a stony, chilling silence. But with other divisions, something astonishing happened. While addressing one group of soldiers, he was cheered so loudly that he became overcome with emotion and had to leave the stage in tears. The most dramatic moment occurred when he faced the 3rd Infantry Division. An eyewitness, Major Ted Conway, described Patton mounting a platform to address 3,000 troops. He began with a single word, "Men," but he never got to his apology. The entire division erupted in cheers, throwing their steel helmets into the air and chanting, "Georgie, Georgie." Patton just stood there, tears streaming down his face, humbled not by his superiors, but by the unexpected loyalty of his men. He finally gave up, walked off the platform, and as he drove away, saluted the entire division, which stood saluting him back. In their eyes, he was the tough, demanding, but victorious leader who had led them to glory. They were on his side. Patton had swallowed his pride, but the story wasn't over. Months later, the muckraking journalist Drew Pearson, looking to settle a score with the Roosevelt administration, got wind of the incidents from a source in the Office of Strategic Services and broke the story on his national radio program on November 21st, 1943. The scandal exploded in the American press, and now Patton could only wait in his exile, wondering if he would ever lead an army in combat again. For nearly a year, General George S. Patton was a ghost. As the Allies planned the invasion of France, his old subordinate, Omar Bradley, was chosen to lead the American ground forces for D-Day. Patton, meanwhile, was sent to England to command a Phantom Army. It was perhaps the most ironic and brilliant punishment imaginable. The command was called the 1st United States Army Group, or FUSAG. It was the centerpiece of Operation Fortitude, the most elaborate deception plan of the war. FUSAG was an army of inflatable rubber tanks, dummy aircraft, and fabricated radio traffic, all designed to convince the German High Command that the main Allied invasion would strike at the Pas-de-Calais, the shortest point across the English Channel. Patton was the bait. The Germans so feared and respected him that they refused to believe the Allies would sideline their best battlefield commander for merely slapping a soldier. They were convinced he would lead the main assault. The deception worked perfectly. Hitler kept 15 powerful infantry and panzer divisions in reserve at Pas-de-Calais, waiting for Patton's ghost invasion, which gave the real Allied forces the critical time they needed to establish a foothold on the beaches of Normandy. Patton played his part, touring England and giving speeches, but inwardly he was in agony, terrified that the war would end without him. Did the incident fundamentally change the man? It's debatable. His personal views on shell shock likely never softened. He still saw it as a failure of will. But he did learn a brutal lesson in political survival, to keep some opinions to himself. His long exile finally ended in July 1944, a month after the D-Day landings. He was given command of the U.S. Third Army, which was already in France. He was back in the war. What followed was one of the most astonishing campaigns in modern military history, as Patton's Third Army roared across France, covering hundreds of miles in a relentless armored blitzkrieg. His ultimate redemption came that winter, during Germany's last desperate gamble, the Battle of the Bulge. In December 1944, German armies smashed through the American lines in the Ardennes forest, surrounding the 101st Airborne Division at the crucial crossroads town of Bastogne. At a crisis meeting of Allied commanders, Eisenhower asked his generals how long it would take to mount a counterattack to relieve the besieged men. Others spoke of days, even a week. But in a legendary moment, Patton declared he could disengage his entire army, which was then fighting 90 degrees away, turn north, and attack in just 48 hours. It was a maneuver most thought impossible. And he did it. Through bitter snow and ice, Patton's Third Army slammed into the German southern flank, relieved Bastogne on December 26th, and broke the back of Hitler's final offensive. So, was Patton a flawed hero or a brilliant monster? Was Eisenhower a genius for reprimanding him but keeping him in the fight, or did he enable an abusive leader? The truth is far too complex for a simple verdict. Patton never received the supreme command he so desperately craved. The scandals had marked him as too great a political liability. But he was never cast aside. Secretary of War Henry Stimson argued to keep him in the war by quoting President Abraham Lincoln's defense of another hard-fighting, controversial general, Ulysses S. Grant. "I can't spare this man. He fights." The slaps in Sicily almost destroyed him, yet his strange punishment, leading a ghost army, was a critical component of D-Day's success. His redemption at the Battle of the Bulge cemented his place in the pantheon of military legends. He remains a walking contradiction, a leader who inspired unparalleled valor, but whose rigid personal code made him blind to the very real suffering of his men. The story forces us to confront a difficult question. In a desperate war for the fate of the world, what are you willing to overlook in order to win? To ensure more stories like this are brought to light, please subscribe, like, and share this video with someone you think needs to hear it. And tell us in the comments what you believe was the most surprising part of this entire story.